The wind in Oklahoma didn't scream in 1929. It sang. It was a rhythmic, low-bellied hum that moved through the vast expanses of Cimarron County like a lover's whisper, bowing the heads of a million amber stalks. To Silas Sterling, standing on the porch of a farmhouse that smelled of cedar wax and hope, the world didn't just look profitable, it looked infinite. He leaned against the railing, a tin cup of black coffee warming his calloused palms. Before him lay 300 acres of winter wheat, a shimmering sea of gold that seemed to catch the sunlight and hold it captive. In the American West, they called this the Great Plow-Up, a time when the soil was black gold and the rain followed the plow. "It's a heavy crop, Silas," a soft voice came from behind the screen door. Sarah stepped out, wiping her hands on a floral apron. She looked at the horizon with the same reverence one might give a cathedral. At 28, the sun had already etched fine lines at the corners of her eyes, but her smile remained as bright as the day they'd staked their claim. "The heaviest yet," Silas replied, his voice thick with pride. "The boys at the grain elevator in Guyman say the price is holding at $1 a bushel. If we harvest by July, we're not just paying off the new John Deere tractor, Sarah. We're buying the North 40 acres from Miller." Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder. "And the piano? For Mary?" Silas chuckled, a deep, resonant sound. "The piano, the sheet music, and maybe even a silk dress for the finest lady in the Panhandle. The American dream isn't a dream anymore, Sarah. It's sitting right there in the dirt, waiting for us to pick it up." The Gospel of the Plow. The late 1920s in the southern plains felt like a miracle. For decades, the land had been considered a desert, but a cycle of unusually wet years had convinced a generation of suitcase farmers and pioneers that the climate had changed forever. Silas was a man of the earth, but in 1929 he felt like a king. He spent his afternoons in the seat of his tractor, a roaring beast of iron that did the work of 10 horses. The smell of turned earth, rich, moist, and pungent, was better than any perfume. Every time the steel discs sliced through the buffalo grass, unturning the sod to reveal the dark belly of the plains, Silas felt he was carving out a legacy. In town, the talk was all of progress. At the general store, men in denim overalls leaned against counters stacked with canned peaches and new leather boots. "The rain's been steady, the soil's deep, and the market's hungry," Old Man Higgins would say, waving a newspaper headline about the booming stock market in New York. "Even the city folks are getting rich on paper. We're getting rich on bread." There was an intoxication in the air. The local bank was handing out credit like Sunday candy. Silas had taken a loan for the latest machinery, convinced that the land would always give back more than it took. He wasn't alone. Everyone was doubling down, tearing up every inch of native grass to plant more wheat, more gold, more progress. The last Sunday of plenty. That June, the Sterlings hosted a shindig for the neighboring farms. It was a celebration of a harvest that hadn't even been reaped yet, a testament to their absolute certainty. Tables were hammered together from scrap wood and covered in checkered cloths. There were fried chickens, tubs of potato salad, and jars of sweet tea cooled in the cellar. Mary, their 6-year-old daughter, ran through the tall wheat with the neighbors' children, their laughter lost in the rustle of the stalks. "Look at them, Silas," Miller said, the neighbor whose land Silas intended to buy. "My father moved here in a sod house. Now my kids are asking for a radio to hear the jazz bands in Chicago." "It's a new world, Miller," Silas said, raising a glass of cider. "The frontier is gone. We've tamed it." As the sun began to set, the sky turned a bruised purple and burnt orange. It was a beautiful, terrifyingly vast sky. For a brief moment, the wind died completely. The silence was absolute. Silas looked toward the west, toward the horizon where the land met the heavens. For a split second, he felt a shiver, not of cold, but of a strange ancestral instinct. The soil beneath his boots felt too loose, too dry on the very surface, but he shook the feeling off. The bank balance was high, the tractor was fueled, and the clouds promised rain by Tuesday. The cracks in the porcelain. By late August, the first whispers of unease began to drift in from the east. The radio mentioned a stutter in the stock market. Some of the big investors in New York were nervous. Just city talk, Silas told himself as he greased the gears of the thresher. The heat began to bake the topsoil into a fine gray powder. The golden horizon started to lose its luster, turning a sickly pale yellow. Still, Silas and his neighbors pushed harder. They plowed more. They stripped more grass. They prepared for an even bigger planting in the fall, certain that the great bull market of the 1920s was an eternal engine. And on an evening in October 1929, Silas sat at the kitchen table, tallying his ledgers by the light of a kerosene lamp. The numbers looked magnificent. On paper, he was a wealthy man. He looked at Sarah, who was sewing a ribbon on Mary's hat. "Next year," Silas whispered, "we'll be the biggest producers in the county." He didn't know that 3 days later, a Black Tuesday in New York would send the world spiraling end over. He didn't know that the moisture he had relied on was a fluke of history. He didn't see that the golden horizon was actually a mirage, and that the very soil he had turned into a graveyard of grass was about to take flight. For now, the air was still warm, the wheat was tall, and the American dream was a harvest away. Silas Sterling went to bed that night, feeling like a giant, unaware that the wind was gathering its strength to blow his world away.
The transition from the golden era to the leaden age did not happen with a thunderclap. It began with a silence, a heavy, suffocating stillness that settled over the Oklahoma panhandle in the early months of 1930. The rain, which had once been a reliable partner in the dance of the harvest, had simply stepped off the floor. Silas Sterling stood in the center of his north field, kicking the earth with the toe of his boot. The soil, once a rich chocolate brown that felt like velvet between the fingers, was now the color of a dead man's ashes. It didn't clump, it didn't hold. It simply disintegrated into a fine, crystalline powder that the sun baked into a crust. "The moisture's gone, Silas," Miller said, pulling up in his battered truck. The man looked older, his face etched with the worry of 1,000 unpaid debts. "The bank in Guyman stopped lending. They say the great crash in the East wasn't just a hiccup, it's a cardiac arrest." Silas didn't look up. He was watching a hawk circling high above. "The clouds will come, Miller. They always do. This land owes us that much." But the land owed them nothing. The millions of acres of buffalo grass that had once anchored the soil to the earth were gone, replaced by endless rows of wheat that now lay withered and stunted. The plow, their instrument of progress, had become their weapon of destruction, the omen of the North. It was a Sunday in mid-April when the world finally changed. The morning had been deceptively clear, though the air felt thin, as Sarah described it. There was a copper taste in the mouth, a metallic tang that made the horses restless in their stalls. Inside the farmhouse, Sarah was trying to bake bread, but the flour seemed to be fighting her. Even with the windows shut tight, a thin film of gray dust had settled on the kitchen table. "Silas, look at the horizon!" Mary's voice, sharp and terrified, cut through the midday heat. Silas stepped out onto the porch, wiping grease from his hands. His heart skipped a beat. To the north, the sky wasn't blue, nor was it the gray of a coming rainstorm. It was a wall of solid obsidian black. It looked like a mountain range that had suddenly decided to move, a rolling, tumbling mass of darkness that reached from the earth to the very heavens. "Get inside," Silas bellowed. "Sarah, get the wet rags.
Mary, under the table, now! The arrival of the black blizzard. The black blizzard didn't arrive with the sound of wind. It arrived with a roar like 1,000 freight trains derailed and screaming. One moment the sun was a pale, sickly disk. The next, it was midnight. As the wall of dust hit the house, the structure groaned. The fine silt, driven by 60-mile-an-hour winds, found every microscopic crack in the walls. It hissed as it poured through the keyholes and under the doors like a spectral fluid. Silas threw his weight against the front door, bolting it, but the dust was already there. It filled their lungs, grittier than sand and more suffocating than smoke. "I can't breathe, Daddy," Mary cried, coughing violently. Sarah moved with a desperate efficiency born of terror. She grabbed the bedsheets, soaked them in the precious remaining water from the pitcher, and draped them over the windows and the child's face. Within minutes, the white sheets turned a muddy, bruised brown. They huddled together in the center of the kitchen, lit only by a single flickering kerosene lamp that struggled to burn in the oxygen-starved air. Outside, the world was being erased. The wheat they had prayed over, the tractor Silas was so proud of, the very fences that marked their existence, all were being buried under a tide of airborne earth. The static and the scars. For 6 hours the storm raged. The friction of the dust particles moving at high speeds created massive amounts of static electricity. Blue sparks flickered along the barbed wire fences outside, and every time Silas touched a metal door handle, a painful jolt shot up his arm. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological weight. Silas felt as if the earth itself was trying to vomit them out. This wasn't a natural disaster. It felt like a judgment. "Is the world ending, Silas?" Sarah whispered, her voice muffled by a wet rag. Silas didn't answer. He couldn't. He thought of the deep plowing he had done, the way he had bragged about taming the plains. He realized then that they hadn't tamed anything. They had only stripped the skin off a giant, and now the giant was bleeding dust. The aftermath, a world of gray. When the wind finally died down to a low moan and the sun began to peek through the haze, the Sterlings stepped outside. The golden horizon was gone. In its place was a lunar landscape. The wheat fields were buried under ripples of dust that looked like frozen waves of a dirty ocean. The yard was filled with the carcasses of birds that had been choked mid-flight. Silas walked toward the barn and stopped. His prized tractor was half buried in a drift, its engine likely ruined by the abrasive silt that had found its way into every piston. He looked at his hands. The dust was etched into the lines of his palms, a permanent stain of failure. In town, the news was even worse. The black blizzard had traveled hundreds of miles, reaching all the way to the East Coast, dropping Oklahoma soil on the decks of ships in the Atlantic. The world now knew about the tragedy of the plains, but the world had no bread to offer. Sarah stood beside him, looking at her withered garden. "We can't grow anything in this, Silas. It's not soil anymore. It's just grave dirt." Silas looked toward the horizon. The black wall was gone for now, but the sky remained a dull, leaden gray, a heavy ceiling that seemed to press down on their dreams. The American dream had turned into a nightmare of grit and hunger. "We stay," Silas said, though his voice lacked its usual iron. "We wait for the rain." But as he looked at the dead birds and the buried fields, he knew deep down that the rain was a ghost that had forgotten home. The life they knew was over. The struggle to survive had just begun. If the black blizzard was a sudden blow to the heart, the winter of 1931 was a slow starvation of the soul. In the Sterling household, the passage of time was no longer measured by the rising of the sun or the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, but by the receding line of jars in the cellar. Silas Sterling sat at the kitchen table, the wood scarred and pitted by the grit that never truly left their lives. Before him lay his ledger, once a book of triumphs, now a record of surrender. The bank had sent another notice, a polite, cold piece of paper that spoke of foreclosure and delinquency, as if those words could describe the dust-choked reality of a man losing his birthright. The geography of hunger. Sarah stood by the stove, stirring a pot of Hoover hog, a bitter nickname for the jackrabbit Silas had caught in a snare that morning. There was no beef, the cattle had long since been sold or had succumbed to dust pneumonia, their lungs filled with the very earth they used to graze upon. She opened the larder door, a ritual she performed with increasing dread. A year ago, these shelves groaned under the weight of preserved peaches, green beans, salted pork, and sacks of white flour. Now it was a hollow cavern. 1 jar of pickled beets, a half sack of cornmeal infested with weevils that she carefully sifted out every morning, 2 wrinkled potatoes that looked like the hands of the elderly. "We're down to the dregs, Silas," she said softly, not looking back. Her voice had lost its melody, replaced by a flat, iron-like resonance. Silas closed the ledger. "I'm going into town. Maybe Miller or the cooperative has news on the government relief flour." "The government," Sarah whispered, a ghost of a bitter laugh escaping her. "They sent seeds last month, Silas. Seeds for a land that hasn't seen a drop of water in 18 months. You might as well plant stones." The trial of dignity. The drive into Guyman was a journey through a graveyard. The once sturdy fences were now nothing more than jagged teeth sticking out of the drifts. Silas passed the Miller farm and saw the "for sale" sign hammered into the dust. It didn't even say "for sale" anymore. Someone had scrawled "broken gone" across it in charcoal. In town, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of fog, the fog of shame. Men who once were the pillars of the community, deacons of the church, and masters of their own domains, now stood in a ragged line behind the general store. Silas took his place in the line. He kept his eyes on his boots. To look up was to see the reflection of his own failure in the eyes of his neighbors. "Step up, Sterling," the clerk said, his voice weary. He handed Silas a small sack of Red Cross flour and a tin of lard. "Is this it?" Silas asked, his voice cracking. "Thousands are hungry, Silas. This has to last you a month. Take it or leave it for the man behind you." Silas took the bag. It felt lighter than a feather, yet it weighed a ton on his conscience. He was a provider, a protector. Now he was a beggar in his own county. The piano and the sacrifice. That evening the house was cold. Coal was a luxury they could no longer afford, so they burned Russian thistles, tumbleweeds, and dried cow chips. The heat was fleeting and smelled of acrid smoke. Mary, thin and pale, sat on the floor playing with a doll made of corn husks. She didn't ask for candy anymore. She didn't even ask for milk. Children of the Depression learned the vocabulary of no before they learned the alphabet. Silas looked at the piano in the corner, the one he had promised would be Mary's future. It was a beautiful mahogany upright, now covered in a fine layer of silt, despite Sarah's constant cleaning. "I saw a man in town," Silas began, his voice barely audible over the whistling wind. "A trader from back east. He's buying furniture. Real money, not credit, not scrip." The room went silent. Sarah's hand stopped mid-stitch on a tattered shirt. She looked at the piano, then at Mary, then at the empty larder. "It's her future, Silas," Sarah said, her eyes filling with a fierce, protective light. "If she doesn't eat, she has no future," Silas countered, his heart breaking as the words left his mouth. "That piano is worth 3 months of groceries, maybe a cow, a real cow with milk for her bones." Sarah bowed her head. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing Silas had ever felt. It was the sound of a dream being dismantled, piece by piece, to keep the fire of life burning just a little longer. The iron will. Later that night, after Mary had been tucked into bed under layers of ragged quilts, Silas found Sarah in the kitchen. She wasn't crying. Instead, she was meticulously cleaning the weevils out of the last bit of cornmeal by the light of a dying ember. "We're not beaten, Silas," she said, her eyes meeting his with a terrifying intensity. "Look at this place, Silas. The bank is coming. The sky is falling. I can't even feed you." Sarah walked over and took his rough, scarred hands in hers. "The sky has fallen before. We are the ones who stayed. Miller left. The O'Donnells left. But as long as there is a spark in that stove and a drop of blood in our hearts, we are the masters of this house. We will eat the dust if we have to, but we will not crawl." Silas looked at his wife and saw a strength he hadn't recognized during the golden years. Her beauty had hardened into something more durable, something like diamond. He pulled her close, the smell of dust and wood smoke between them. They were hungry, they were broke, and the world outside was a gray wasteland. But in that kitchen, amidst the empty jars and the looming debt, a new kind of American dream was being forged. It wasn't a dream of gold and grain anymore. It was a dream of pure, unadulterated survival. "Tomorrow," Silas whispered, "I'll fix the roof, and I'll find a way to keep that piano." He knew it was a lie, but it was a necessary lie. In the winter of 1931, hope was the only thing in the larder that didn't run out. The rumors arrived not by radio or newspaper, but like a virus carried on the hot, dry winds. They were whispered in the bread lines, shared over the fences of foreclosed farms, and passed along like secret gospels between men who had forgotten the color of a dollar bill. California. The word itself sounded like water. It started with the handbills, bright neon orange slips of paper that appeared overnight on the windshields of rusted Model Ts and the doors of boarded-up banks. They showed pictures of orange groves so heavy with fruit the branches kissed the earth, and rows of pea vines stretching toward a horizon that was stubbornly, miraculously green. 800 pickers wanted, the flyers screamed. High wages, good housing, a land of plenty. To Silas Sterling, these flyers were more than advertisements. They were cruel taunts. He stood in the dust-choked main street of Guyman, clutching a crumpled orange slip. Around him, the Okies, as the papers in the East were starting to call them, gathered in small, desperate clusters. "It's a trick," Miller muttered, leaning against a lamppost. He looked skeletal, his skin the color of parched leather. "They just want cheap labor to drive the prices down. You go out there, Silas, and you'll be a beggar in a different climate, that's all." "But there's water there, Miller," Silas replied, his eyes fixed on the image of the orange grove, "and no dust. They say the air tastes like the ocean, not like a graveyard." The death of the deed. The decision was finalized not by choice, but by the cold strike of a gavel. 2 weeks later, the bank representative arrived, a man in a clean suit that looked alien in the landscape of grit. He didn't look Silas in the eye as he handed over the papers. The Sterling farm, 3 generations of sweat and blood, was now the property of a corporation that lived in a skyscraper 1,000 miles away. "You have 72 hours to vacate the premises," the man said, his voice as dry as the air. That night, the Sterling farmhouse was silent. No one ate. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her hands resting on the wood she had polished every day for 10 years. "We can't take the piano, Silas." It wasn't a question. It was an admission of defeat. "No," Silas said, his voice cracking. "We can't take the beds. We can't take the plow. We can't take the memories." "Where will we go?" Mary asked from the doorway, clutching her corn-husk doll. "Will we sleep in the dirt?" Silas knelt down and pulled his daughter close. "No, Mary, we're going to the west, to a place where the sun is kind and the trees grow food you can pick with your own hands. We're going to California." The Great Deconstruction. The next 48 hours were a blur of agonizing choices. How do you fit a lifetime into a 1924 Hudson Super 6? They sold what they could for pennies. The piano, the symbol of their vanished middle-class dreams, was bought by a scavenger for $5. Silas watched them haul it away, the keys clinking a discordant mourning note as it bounced over the ruts. They stripped the car of its back seats to make room for crates. Into the cramped space they shoved a sack of flour and a jar of lard, a battered iron skillet, 2 quilts sewn by Sarah's grandmother, Silas's tool chest, a gallon of water that felt more precious than gold. Every item left behind felt like a limb being severed. The family Bible was tucked under the driver's seat. The framed photograph of Silas's parents was wrapped in a rag and hidden in a toolbox. On the final morning, Sarah walked through the empty rooms. The dust was already reclaiming the house, settling in the corners where their laughter used to live. She reached the kitchen window and with a piece of charcoal wrote on the wall, "We were here, the Sterlings, 1901 to 1932. God help us." The departure. As the sun began to rise, a pale, filtered glow through the perennial haze, Silas cranked the engine. The Hudson groaned, coughed a cloud of blue smoke, and sputtered to life. They drove down the long dirt driveway for the last time. Silas didn't look in the rearview mirror. He couldn't bear to see the house shrinking, a lonely island in a sea of gray dust. As they reached the main road, they saw them, a literal exodus. The highway was a river of junk-laden cars, mattresses tied to roofs with fraying rope, children peered out from under tarpaulins, and eyes filled with the same haunting mixture of terror and hope. "Is everyone going, Daddy?" Mary asked, watching a family on a horse-drawn wagon pass them by. "Everyone who has the spirit left to move," Silas said. Sarah looked at the orange flyer pinned to the dashboard. The whispers of the West had become a roar. It was no longer about getting rich. It was about the basic human right to draw a breath that didn't taste of death. "We're grapes of wrath people now, Silas," Sarah whispered, referencing the phrase she'd heard a preacher use. "No." Silas gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "We're just people looking for home. And if California is the only home left, then we'll take it by storm." The Hudson turned onto Route 66. Behind them lay the ruins of the American heartland. Ahead lay 2,000 miles of desert, mountains, and the fragile golden promise of a new beginning. They were leaving the known hell for an unknown heaven, unaware that the road would be longer and the welcome colder than anything they could imagine.
The Hudson Super 6 was no longer a car. It was a steel hull carrying the remnants of a shipwrecked life. As they pulled onto the asphalt ribbon of Route 66, Silas felt the shift in reality. Behind them lay the dust. Ahead lay the Mother Road, a 2,000-mile vein of hope stretching across the sun-scorched belly of America. The journey was not a drive, it was a siege. The road was a graveyard of overtaxed engines and broken spirits. Every few miles, a car sat abandoned in the ditch, stripped of its tires and its dignity, a silent warning to those still moving. The rhythm of the road. The heat of the Texas panhandle hit them like a physical blow. The air shimmering over the blacktop looked like water, a cruel mirage that Mary would point at only for it to vanish as they approached. "Don't look at it, honey," Sarah would say, her voice raspy from the grit that still lived in her throat. "Keep your eyes on the floor." Inside the car, the temperature climbed to a staggering degree. The leather seats, cracked and peeling, burned through their thin clothes. Silas drove with his jaw set, his ears tuned to every rattle and cough of the engine. A broken fan belt or a blown head gasket wasn't just a mechanical failure, it was a potential death sentence in the middle of the Mojave. At night, they didn't look for hotels, they looked for Hoovervilles, the roadside camps that had sprouted like weeds at every watering hole. The Fellowship of the Dispossessed. The first major camp they stayed in was near Amarillo.
As the sun dipped below the horizon, the desert air turned sharply cold. Silas steered the Hudson into a clearing where dozens of other cars were huddled together like a herd of frightened cattle. The camp was a symphony of misery and resilience. There was the smell of boiling beans, the sound of a harmonica playing a mournful tune, and the low murmur of men talking about the price of gas and the rumors of work. "Where you from?" the man asked Silas as he leaned over his smoking radiator. "Oklahoma, Cimarron County," Silas replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "We're from Arkansas. Third crop failed. The bank took the mules." The man spat into the dust. "Heading to the vineyards near Fresno. They say they're paying 20 cents an hour." In these camps, the Sterlings learned the new social order. There was no Mr. or Ma'am based on land ownership anymore. Dignity was measured by how much water you had left in your canvas bag and whether you were willing to share your fire. Sarah, once the queen of a spotless kitchen, now knelt in the dirt, blow-drying a small fire of sagebrush and dried dung to heat a tin of watered-down stew. She watched Mary playing with other children, kids with hollow cheeks and dusty hair who played a game called Border Guard, where they pretended to turn each other at a phantom gate. The breaking point. The true test of the mother road came in the Arizona desert. The Hudson's tires, worn thin as paper, finally gave out. The sound of the blowout was like a gunshot. Silas steered the lurching car to the shoulder. He sat in the silence for a long moment, his hands shaking on the wheel. They had no spare. "Silas?" Sarah asked softly. He stepped out into the blinding noon sun. The heat felt like it was melting the marrow in his bones. He looked at the vast, uncaring expanse of rock and sand. For the first time, the promised land felt like a lie. "I have to walk to the next camp," he said, his voice hollow. "Stay with the car. Keep the doors locked." He walked for 4 hours. His shoes, already falling apart, let the burning sand chafe his feet. He passed a family sitting by a dead Ford. The mother was staring into space, a dead infant wrapped in a shawl in her arms. Silas didn't stop. He couldn't. He had to be the engine for his own family now. He eventually found a junk dealer at a shack-turned-garage who sold him a patched tire for his last $3, money meant for bread. He rolled the tire back under the punishing sun, his lungs burning, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. When he returned, Sarah was standing by the road with a jug of water, her face sun-scorched, but her eyes filled with a fierce, terrifying resolve. She didn't ask about the money. She just helped him heave the car up on the jack. The silhouette of the Sierras. By the time they reached the foot of the mountains, the Hudson was a ghost of a vehicle, held together by baling wire and desperation. But as they crested the final ridge of the Tehachapi Mountains, the world changed. Below them lay a valley so green it hurt their eyes. It looked like a painted backdrop from a movie. "Is that it, Daddy?" Mary whispered, standing up in the back seat to see over the crates. "That's it," Silas said. But as they descended into the valley, they saw something the flyers hadn't mentioned. They saw the bum blockades, local police standing by the road with clubs. They saw signs that read "No Okies Wanted" and "Go Back to the Dust." Route 66 had delivered them to the doorstep of the West, but the mother road had no more milk to give. They had survived the desert and the hunger, but they were about to realize that the hardest part of the journey wasn't the 2,000 miles behind them. It was the first mile into a world that hated them for their poverty. Silas gripped the wheel, his eyes on the green valley that looked increasingly like a beautiful, guarded cage. "Keep your heads up," he told his family. "We didn't come this far to turn back."
If Route 66 was the birth canal of the new American exodus, the California border was its jagged teeth. As the Sterling's Hudson Super 6 crested the final ridge of the Tehachapi Mountains, the view was breathtaking, a lush, verdant tapestry of orchards and vineyards that seemed to glow under the golden sun. But as they descended into the valley, the air grew thick, not with the scent of oranges, but with the stench of hostility. The Iron Gate. At the state line, the road was narrowed by a bum blockade. Silas slowed the car as he saw the flash of sunlight on badges. Men in khaki uniforms, armed with nightsticks and a cold, bureaucratic indifference, stood like sentries at a fortress. "Where you from, boy?" a deputy asked, leaning his elbows on the driver's side door. His eyes scanned the rusted Hudson, the mattresses tied to the roof, and Sarah's weary face. "Oklahoma," Silas said, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. "We saw the handbills. We're here to pick." The deputy spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the dry asphalt. "Handbills don't give you a right to breathe our air. You got any money on you? Real money?" Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out his last $4.60. The deputy laughed, a dry, rattling sound. $4? That won't even buy you a burial plot here. Move along, but don't get comfortable. We don't want your kind clogging up our schools or our jails." As they drove past, a group of locals standing by the road jeered. One man threw a stone that clattered against the Hudson's fender. "Go back to the dust, Okies. We're full." Mary shrunk back into the shadows of the crates. "Why are they angry, Daddy? We didn't do anything." Silas didn't answer. He couldn't. The Promised Land was guarded by men who saw poverty as a contagious disease. The Hooverville of the damned. By nightfall, they reached the outskirts of a town near Bakersfield. They couldn't afford a campsite with water, so they were forced into a Hooverville, a sprawling, chaotic city of shadows built on the banks of a muddy irrigation ditch. The camp was a vision of purgatory. They were shacks made of corrugated tin, flattened cardboard boxes, and old burlap sacks. The smell was an assault: open sewage, wood smoke, and the sour tang of unwashed bodies. "Is this where we live now?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with a terror Silas had never seen before. "Just for tonight," Silas lied. It was a lie he would tell for the next 3 months. They set up their camp under a dying willow tree. Silas used a tarp to create a lean-to against the car. As Sarah tried to boil the last of their cornmeal over a fire of scavenged sticks, a woman from the neighboring shack, a structure made of car parts and mud, walked over. "Don't drink the ditch water," the woman said, her voice like sandpaper. "The babies get the black flux from it. There's a pump 2 miles up the road, but the owner charges a nickel a bucket." "A nickel for water?" Sarah gasped. "In California, even the air has a price tag." The next morning, Silas went looking for work. He stood at the edge of a peach orchard, joining a crowd of 500 men for 50 jobs. The owner, a man in a white linen suit who didn't get out of his truck, shouted the terms through a megaphone. 5 cents a box. Take it or leave it." 5 cents, a man cried out. "Last year it was 10. We can't feed our families on 5. Then go back to Oklahoma. There's 1,000 more behind you who will do it for 3. Silas got a job that day. He spent 12 hours under a sun that felt different than the Oklahoma sun. It was a humid, heavy heat that made the lungs ache. By sunset, his hands were stained orange and his back felt like it had been lashed. He earned 60 cents. When he walked back to the Hooverville, he passed a local grocery store. A sign in the window read, "Dogs and Okies not allowed." He stood in front of the glass, looking at his reflection. He was covered in fruit juice and dust. His beard was matted, and his eyes were hollow. He realized then that to the people of California, he wasn't a farmer, a deacon, or a father. He was a mudsill, the lowest layer of humanity. The night of broken spirits. That evening in the camp, a group of vigilantes, local teenagers and shopkeepers armed with pickaxe handles, drove through the Hooverville in a flatbed truck. They threw firecrackers into the tents and screamed obscenities. "Get out of our town, dirty Okies, leeches!" Silas grabbed his tire iron and stood in front of his lean-to, his heart pounding with a murderous rage. He saw Sarah clutching Mary, their faces illuminated by the flickering fires of the camp. They looked like refugees in a war zone, not citizens in their own country. When the truck sped away, the silence that followed was heavier than the noise.
Somewhere in the camp, a woman was wailing. Silas sat down in the dirt. The weight of the broken dream was crushing him. He had sold his heritage, his piano, and his home for the right to be hunted like an animal in a land of plenty. "Silas," Sarah said, crawling out from the lean-to. She sat beside him and took the tire iron from his hand. "They want us to leave. They want us to give up so they can have the land to themselves. Maybe we should have stayed and died in the dust. At least there we had a name." Sarah gripped his arm until it hurt. "No, we have a name here too. We are the Sterlings, and if they want to treat us like weeds, then we'll be the kind of weeds that can't be pulled. We'll grow right through their concrete, Silas. We'll grow until they can't ignore us." Under the leaden sky of a California night, surrounded by the wreckage of 1,000 lives, Silas looked at his wife. The golden horizon was gone, replaced by a horizon of barbed wire and bitterness. But in the dark, a new, harder light was beginning to burn in his eyes.
The Central Valley of California was a lush emerald deception. To a man from the Dust Bowl, it looked like paradise, but to a migrant worker, it was a beautiful factory with a ceiling of fire and a floor of thorns. Silas Sterling woke every morning at 4, while the moon was still a pale sliver over the Sierra Nevadas. His bed was a pallet of straw covered by a tattered quilt laid out on the damp earth beneath the Hudson. By 5, he was standing at the gates of the fruit ranches, a ghost among thousands, waiting for a foreman to point a callous finger in his direction. The weight of the harvest. The work was a rhythmic, soul-crushing labor. Silas was assigned to the peach orchards, rows upon rows of trees so heavy with ripening fruit that the air smelled sickly sweet, almost cloying. The irony was a physical weight. Silas spent 12 hours a day perched on a shaky wooden ladder, his fingers stained a permanent, bruised purple. He picked peaches that were destined for the tables of fine hotels in San Francisco and New York, yet his own stomach felt like a shriveled leather pouch. "Careful with those, Okie," the foreman shouted, his boots kicking up dust as he stalked the rows. "One bruise and the whole crate is trash. I don't pay for trash." Silas didn't look down. He couldn't afford to. He calculated his life in boxes. Every box filled was another 2 cents. To buy a single loaf of bread, he had to pick enough peaches to feed a small village. The math of survival was skewed. The energy he expended picking the fruit was greater than the calories he could afford to buy with his wages. The great sin. The haunting moment of the day came at sunset. Behind the packing sheds, there were massive pits filled with fruit, peaches, oranges, and plums that were deemed surplus or slightly imperfect. Silas watched as a truck backed up to the pit and dumped thousands of pounds of perfectly edible fruit into the lime-covered trench. "Wait!" Silas stepped forward, his voice cracking. "My daughter, she hasn't had fruit in months. Can I take just a few from the top?" The guard, a local boy with a shotgun slung over his shoulder, stepped into his path. "Orders are orders. If we let you take 'em for free, you won't buy 'em at the store. Prices gotta stay up." Silas watched in a trance of horror as the guard poured kerosene over the mountain of fruit and struck a match. The smell of burning sugar filled the air, a sweet, charred scent that smelled like the death of a civilization. This was the great sin that the preachers spoke of, burning food in the sight of the hungry. Back at the Hooverville, the reality of the orchards of irony settled over the Sterling family like a shroud. Sarah was trying to make a soup out of wild mustard greens she had scavenged from the roadside and a single bone she had bought from the butcher for a penny. Mary sat by the fire, her eyes unnaturally large in her thin face. She was drawing pictures in the dirt with a stick, not pictures of houses or dolls, but pictures of apples. "I found some work today, Sarah." Silas dropped a handful of nickels onto the crate they used as a table. Sarah didn't look at the money. She looked at his hands. They were raw, the skin peeling from the caustic fuzz of the peaches and the constant friction of the latter. "You're bleeding, Silas," she whispered. "It's just the price of the day," he replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "I saw them burn 10 tons of peaches today, Sarah. 10 tons. And here we are, boiling weeds, the breaking of the spirit." That night, Mary woke up crying. It wasn't the loud, demanding cry of a toddler. It was the whimpering, exhausted sob of a child whose body was consuming itself. "I'm so hungry, Mama. My tummy feels like there's a fire in it." Sarah reached into her pocket. She had hidden a single bruised peach she had found dropped on the road outside the orchard gates. It was small, dusty, and half-rotten. She carefully sliced away the brown parts and gave the remaining sliver to Mary. The child ate it with a desperation that made Silas turn away. He walked out of the lean-to and stood by the irrigation ditch. The water in the ditch was used to keep the orchards green, but it was forbidden for the migrants to use for their gardens. He looked at the dark silhouette of the trees in the distance, the trees he had spent all day tending. They were his enemies now. The land he had once loved as a partner in Oklahoma had become a cruel master in California. He realized that the promised land wasn't a place of refuge, it was a place of extraction. They wanted the strength of his back and the nimbleness of Sarah's fingers, but they didn't want the burden of their lives. "They think we're machines," Silas whispered to the dark, "but machines don't have memories, and machines don't have a breaking point." The irony of the orchards had done what the dust of Oklahoma couldn't. It had turned his hope into a cold, hard coal of resentment. As he went back to his pallet of straw, Silas didn't pray for rain or for bread. He prayed for the strength to fight back.
The air in the Bakersfield Hooverville had changed. It was no longer just the smell of open sewers and rotting fruit. It was the electric charge of a gathering storm. For months, the growers had played the migrants against each other, lowering wages as each new wave of rusted cars crossed the border. But even a starving dog will bite if cornered, and by the summer of 1933, the people of the ditch banks had been cornered for too long. The midnight meeting. It began not with a loud protest, but with a low hum around the evening fires. Silas sat in the shadows of a large oak tree on the edge of the camp. Gathered around him were 30 men, their faces illuminated by a flickering kerosene lantern. Among them was Miller, his old neighbor from Oklahoma, and a newcomer named Slim, a tall man from Texas with eyes that had seen the inside of more than one labor jail. "We picked today for 4 cents a box," Slim said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Tomorrow, the word is they're dropping it to 3. Can any of you feed a child on 3 cents? A murmur of no rippled through the group. Silas looked at his hands. The fingernails were permanently black, the skin cracked like a dry riverbed. "If we don't pick, they hire the next camp," Silas said, playing the devil's advocate to test the group's resolve. "There are 5,000 people at the weed patch camp who are just as hungry as we are." "That's why we don't just strike this ranch," Slim said, leaning forward. "We strike the valley. We send riders to the other camps. We tell them no one climbs a ladder until we get a living wage and a clean cup of water in the fields." The midnight meeting was a fragile thing. These were men who had always been independent farmers, proud of their self-reliance. Joining a union felt alien to some, almost dangerous. But the hunger of their children was a more powerful motivator than the traditions of the past. Silas found himself becoming a voice of reason in the chaos. He didn't have the fire of Slim's oratory, but he had the quiet dignity of a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to fear. "We aren't asking for the world," Silas told a group of hesitant mothers the next morning. "We're asking for enough to buy the very fruit we pick. We're asking them to treat us like the men and women who built this country, not like the dirt we sleep in." Sarah stood beside him, her presence a silent testament to the struggle.
She had started a soup committee in the camp, pooling the meager scraps of every family into one large pot so that no child went to sleep with a completely empty stomach. This was the foundation of the rebellion, not just a fight for money, but a restoration of community. The day of the empty ladders. The following Tuesday, the sun rose over the orchards, but the usual scramble for the gates didn't happen. Instead, a long, silent line of men and women stood across the entrance to the Thompson Ranch. The foreman drove up in his truck, his face turning a dark, angry purple when he saw the pickets. "Get to work, you lazy tramps! The fruit is dropping!" "We'll work for 7 cents a box," Silas said, stepping forward. He felt a strange lightness in his chest. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking at the ground. "You'll work for 3 or you'll starve," the foreman screamed. He signaled to a group of special deputies, locals hired and armed with hickory axe handles. The violence was sudden and brutal. The deputies moved in, swinging their clubs. Silas felt a sharp blow to his shoulder, sending him to his knees. He saw Miller get hit in the face, blood spraying onto the dusty road. But something happened that the foreman didn't expect. The migrants didn't run. They linked arms. Women stepped into the front line, clutching their aprons. The deputies hesitated. It's one thing to beat a man. It's another to club a mother in front of her child. "You can't kill us all," Sarah shouted, her voice echoing off the packing sheds. "We're already dead to you. What more can you take?" The standoff lasted for 3 days. The fruit began to rot on the branches, the sickly sweet smell of decay becoming a weapon for the workers. The growers were losing thousands of dollars every hour. On the 4th morning, a representative from the Growers Association arrived. He didn't offer an apology, and he didn't offer a silk bed, but he offered a compromise: 6 cents a box and the installation of water pumps in the fields. It wasn't a total victory. It wasn't the American dream restored. But as Silas walked back to the camp, his arm in a makeshift sling Sarah had made, he felt a sense of power he hadn't known since he owned his own land. He had learned that while the golden horizon of Oklahoma was gone, a new horizon was being built, one made of iron and unity. They were no longer Okies or refugees. They were a force. "We did it, Silas," Sarah said that night as they sat by their own fire. They had a small bag of Rio coffee and a loaf of fresh bread, the first fruits of their rebellion. "We did something," Silas replied, looking at Mary, who was chewing on a thick slice of bread. "But the road is still long, Sarah. They'll come for us again." "Let 'em come," Sarah said, her eyes reflecting the orange flames. "We've learned how to stand, and once you learn how to stand, you never forget how to walk." The campfire rebellion had forged a new kind of family, one that spanned across state lines and broken dreams. They were the dispossessed, but for the first time in California, they were also the defiant.
The victory of the strike had been small, measured in pennies and water pumps, but its true value was the shift it caused in the Sterling family's soul. They were no longer leaves blown by the wind. They had begun to grow roots, however shallow, in the hard-packed clay of the Arvin Federal Migrant Camp. The camp, often called Weed Patch, was a miracle of order in a world of chaos. Established by the Farm Security Administration, it offered what the roadside Hoovervilles could not: dignity. There were rows of neat tin cabins, communal showers with hot water, and most importantly, a governing committee run by the migrants themselves. The sanctuary of the soil. One Saturday morning, Silas stood at the edge of the camp's communal garden. The manager, a quiet man named Tom Collins who wore his empathy like a shield, had allocated a small plot, no bigger than a rug, to each family who wished to toil in it. Silas knelt in the dirt. This wasn't the vast 300-acre horizon of Oklahoma. It was a humble patch of earth. But as he ran the soil through his fingers, he realized it was different.
It wasn't the dead, gray powder of the Dust Bowl. It was dark, stubborn, and held the promise of moisture. "What are you planting, Silas?" Sarah asked, walking up behind him with a bucket of water. "Pole beans and squash," Silas said, his voice sounding more like his old self than it had in years. "And maybe a few rows of corn, just to see if the sun remembers how to make them tall." He pressed a single seed into the furrow. It felt like a holy act. After years of watching the earth betray him, Silas was making a peace offering to the land. The schoolhouse dream. While Silas worked the earth, Sarah worked the mind. The camp had a small makeshift school, a tent with wooden benches and a chalkboard that had seen better decades. For Mary, the school was a portal to a world where she wasn't just an Okie. The teacher, a woman who had traveled from the East to help the displaced, didn't look at Mary's patched dress or her thin frame. She looked at the way Mary's eyes lit up when they read about the Great Lakes or the history of the pioneers. "She's the smartest in the class, Sarah," the teacher said one afternoon. "She has a way with words. She doesn't just read them, she feels them." That evening, Sarah sat in their tin cabin, the sound of the evening crickets providing a backdrop to her thoughts. She had been taking extra shifts in the laundry room, saving every nickel she could. "Silas," she said, looking at him across the small lantern, "the camp manager says there's a program, a cooperative. If we can save $50, we can buy into a small plot of land near the foothills. It's rocky, and it'll take years to clear, but it would be ours." Silas stopped sharpening his pocket knife. $50? Sarah, that's a fortune. That's a year of picking. "We've survived the desert, the hunger, and the clubs of the deputies," Sarah said, her voice a low, steady flame. "We can survive a year of saving. Imagine it, Silas. A roof that doesn't leak, a school for Mary that isn't made of canvas, a seed that grows in our own soil." The first sprout. Weeks passed in a blur of back-breaking labor in the commercial orchards, followed by twilight hours in their own garden. The heat was still punishing, and the locals still looked at them with suspicion. But the seed in the dry soil had begun to change them from the inside out. One morning, Mary ran into the cabin, her face flushed with excitement. "Daddy! Mama! Come quick! It's happened!" They followed her to the garden plot. There, pushing through the crust of the earth, was a tiny, vibrant sliver of green. It was a bean sprout, fragile and leaning toward the sun, but it was alive. Silas fell to his knees beside it. He didn't speak. He thought of the millions of acres he had plowed in Oklahoma that were now nothing but ghosts in the wind. He thought of the piano he had sold and the home he had lost. This tiny sprout was more than a vegetable. It was a flag of defiance. It was proof that the Sterlings could not be erased. Later that month, Silas took the Hudson, now a rattling skeleton of a car held together by hope and wire, and drove toward the foothills Sarah had mentioned. He found the plot. It was a rugged, sloping piece of land covered in scrub brush and stones. To any sensible man, it looked like a wasteland. But Silas didn't see a wasteland. He saw a foundation. He saw where the porch would be, facing the sunset. He saw where the garden would expand. He saw a place where Mary could grow up without the smell of a Hooverville in her hair. He reached down and picked up a stone, tossing it to the side. Then he picked up another. It was the first act of clearing his own land. He wasn't a king of a golden horizon anymore. He was a man starting over with a single seed and a pile of rocks. But as the sun set over the California Valley, painting the sky in hues of purple and gold, Silas Sterling felt a familiar weight in his chest, not the weight of despair, but the weight of a promise. The dry soil had been tested by fire and wind, but deep down it still knew how to hold a secret. And the secret was this: life doesn't need a miracle to return. It only needs a hand that refuses to let go of the plow.
The year 1939 arrived not with a roar, but with a steady, rhythmic pulse of change. The Great Depression had not vanished overnight, but the world was no longer the gray, suffocating cage it had been in the early 30s. For the Sterling family, the decade had been a brutal kiln, burning away their vanities and leaving behind something tempered, hard, and unbreakable. Silas Sterling stood on the porch of the small hand-built house in the California foothills. It wasn't the grand manor he had envisioned in the golden horizon of 1929. It was a sturdy two-room structure made of salvaged timber and stone, but every nail in the floorboards had been paid for in sweat, and every stone in the chimney had been hauled by his own aching back. The return of the green. Below him, the small plot of land they had reclaimed from the scrub was thriving. The seed in the dry soil had become a harvest. There were rows of vegetables, a few fruit trees that were finally beginning to take hold, and a small patch of flowers that Sarah tended with a devotion that bordered on the religious. The dust was gone, at least from the air. The black blizzards were now stories told to wide-eyed children who couldn't imagine a sky that turned to ink at noon. The government's conservation efforts, the planting of windbreaks, and the return of a more natural rain cycle had healed the wounds of the heartland, but the scars remained on the maps and in the hearts of those who had fled. "The radio says there's a draft coming, Silas," Sarah said, stepping out to join him. She looked different now. The desperate hunger had left her face, replaced by a quiet, weathered grace. Her hands were still calloused, but they no longer trembled. "The world is changing again, Sarah," Silas replied, looking toward the distant horizon. "They say there's a war brewing in Europe. Factories are opening up in the cities. They'll need steel, and they'll need men." The legacy of the road. Mary, now a teenager with the sharp, observant eyes of a survivor, sat on the steps reading a book. She had not only attended the camp school, but had earned a scholarship to a high school in the valley. She was the first Sterling who would not live her life by the whim of the clouds. "I'm writing my essay, Daddy," Mary said, looking up, "about the road, about Route 66. "What are you calling it?" asked Silas. "The Unyielding Spirit," she said firmly, "because the dust tried to bury us, and the border tried to break us, but we're still here. We aren't the people we were when we left Oklahoma. We're something better." Silas looked at his daughter and realized she was right. They had lost their farm, their piano, and their sense of security, but in the crucible of the Depression, they had discovered a wealth that the bank couldn't foreclose on, the knowledge that they could endure. The American resilience. As the sun began to set, casting long amber shadows across the valley, Silas felt a profound sense of peace. The American dream was no longer about a golden horizon of easy wealth. It was about the unyielding spirit, the ability to lose everything and still find the courage to plant a seed the next morning. He thought of the thousands of families still in the camps, the ones who hadn't found their plot of land yet. He knew their struggle wasn't over, but he also knew that the Okies, the Arkies, and the dispossessed of the plains had changed the DNA of the West. They had brought with them a grit that would soon build the bombers of World War II and the suburbs of the 50s. "We survived, didn't we?" Sarah whispered, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We did more than survive, Sarah," Silas said, taking her hand. "We remained." The final horizon. The story of the Sterlings was the story of a nation. It was a journey from the arrogance of plenty to the humility of want, and finally to the strength of recovery. The dust had taken their past, but it had given them a future built on a foundation of iron. As the first stars began to twinkle over the Sierras, Silas looked down at his hands. They were the hands of a laborer, stained by the earth and scarred by the sun. But as he closed them into fists, he felt no weakness.
He felt the steady, thumping heart of a man who had walked through the fire and come out on the other side. The black blizzard was a memory, the empty larder was a lesson, but the unyielding spirit was the truth. Silas turned and walked back into the house, the light from the windows glowing like a beacon in the gathering dark. Behind him, the land lay quiet, the seeds in the soil sleeping and ready for the morning. The Sterlings were home.